Somewhere in your social circles, you probably have somebody who've had some problems. Someone who maybe has struggled to find direction. Maybe they've struggled with addiction or something like that. They've been a drinker or used drugs over the years, and they've been trying to kick their addiction, but they just haven't been able to get a handle on life. They haven't been able to move on and stand on their own 2 feet. But then something changes. Something positive starts happening in their life. They've found something to believe in, and they start looking a little healthier. Maybe they've started working out. Maybe they've started thinking a little bit differently. They stand a little taller. They start being more social. Then you start learning about it. You start trying to figure out why, and well, maybe they just started doing yoga, or maybe they found spirituality, or maybe they joined a religion of some sort. And at first, you're happy about this. You're happy for them. You're glad that they found something that's helping them out, that's helping them escape from this suffering that they seem to have been in their entire lives. But then something starts to change. Something just seems a little bit off, a little at a time. Slowly they start making comments that make them seem hostile to their former self, to their former activities, to the way that they used to be. And then they start being a bit more hostile towards the people that they've been connected to. Maybe they start getting hostile towards you. Maybe they start criticizing you for not also believing in this thing that they've now found. Maybe they're starting to say that this is the only way. They've found some ultimate truth, that anybody who believes any different, or anybody who even criticizes them, or even questions what they believe, is wrong. They start thinking of you as the enemy. They start pushing you out of their lives. They start getting ultimately toxic. And then suddenly it's all they talk about. It's all they can ever talk about. You can't really have conversations about anything other than what they now believe, what has now saved them. And the person that you knew kind of just fades away. It's a bit sad to see, but I know a few people who have gone this way. And I've come to realize that it's an addiction. They've traded one addiction for another. I've talked quite a bit about addictions in the last few days, and I'm working on a long-form project on the topic as well. And there's lots of different kinds of addictions, lots of different objects of addiction that one might get hooked on. 2 days ago, I talked about notification addiction to this thing beeping, and then you leap to gain the information that it's sending at you. Yesterday, I talked about being addicted to pain and aggression and violence and high-intensity negative emotions, because that can be pretty addictive too. Today, though, I'm talking about basically religion. But I don't mean literally religion per se. I don't mean that all religion is an addiction, although some religions absolutely can be an addiction. But what I'm talking about is a specific genre of addictions that work kind of like religions. And this can include things like spirituality, just vague, general sense of spirituality. It can involve literally religions, as well as, cults, and even political cults, political ideologies. Basically what I'm talking about here is addictive worldviews, addictive ideologies, addictive narratives for configuring your worldview. The prototypical example I'll use here is born-again Christians, because they're pretty obviously addicted to their religion. Now, this isn't a critique of Christianity per se, because I go to a Christian church. I hang out with a lot of Christians. I support the idea of Christianity in a vague sort of way. Not all religion, not all Christianity is problematic in this way. Not all of it is an addiction in this way. Just the kind that I'm trying to refer to here. Now, what separates the addictive form of religion from the not-so-addictive form of religion is the exclusiveness of the worldview. Basically, if it claims a monopoly on truth, a monopoly on your worldview configuring narrative, then it can be addictive. To explain this, I should probably talk about what addiction is a bit first. Now, there's many different objects of addiction and many different mechanisms by which you can be addicted to something or what it could be. The traditional understanding of addiction, and one that's surprisingly still prevalent in this day and age, is that it's just a moral failing, that it's an individual choice, a failure to do what's right for yourself or your family or your community, and you're just choosing to throw your life away in this way by abusing alcohol or drugs or whatever, But this doesn't really make all that much sense, because why would someone choose to do this when there are alternatives? Why would someone choose to be an alcoholic their entire lives when, clearly there's some negative consequences to all of that? When we started doing science during the Enlightenment period, we started thinking in terms of like brain chemistry and the neurochemical response to the drug in question. So you take this drug, say an opiate or something like that, and it hooks you in terms of your brain chemistry. Now, there is some truth to this, obviously, because there are some drugs that are indeed chemically addictive. If you don't feed your addiction to opiates and you withdraw suddenly, it can be life-threatening. Like, you can actually die from opiate withdrawal. But it doesn't explain the things that aren't chemically addictive, and it certainly doesn't explain the things that aren't actually drugs. You can be addicted to like gambling, and gambling certainly isn't chemically addictive. There's a slight variation on this in terms of people's like neuromechanics, that some people just have a addictive personality, somebody who is just like prone to this sort of thing, the disease model of addiction. And this is a little more explanatory, but it doesn't necessarily explain all of it. Because like there are some people who can be hooked on something and then they'll be off and then everything will be fine. They'll never face addiction again. It also doesn't explain people who just fall into it without any explanation at all. Why would somebody whose life is going okay just all of a sudden end up with addictions, whereas they didn't before? More contemporary understandings think of addiction in terms of like a social phenomenon rather than a purely psychological one. It's not an individualistic failure. It's not a problem with the individual. It's a problem with your social situation. If you live in a society that kind of sucks, if you're living in an environment that's absolutely awful, you're going to want something that's going to make that pain go away. And so we see addiction as being a pain management technique, something that you're using this substance or activity or whatever you're addicted to in order to anesthetize away a discomfort of some sort. This makes a lot more sense, and it can explain things like, well, what I'm talking about now. By this model, the ultimate cause of addiction, and the cause that's most readily treated by this particular kind of addiction, is this feeling of disconnectedness, isolatedness, lack of direction, lack of centrality in one's life, an inability to like grasp onto something that means something, where you're not quite sure who you are, or where you're going, or what anything means. There's kind of like a rudderless ship quality to it, and I think a lot of us do feel that, and I struggle with this nihilism a lot, of course. But that's what makes something like a religion, or what I'm using religion broadly to describe here, so tempting and so addictive. Because these sorts of ideologies, they give you a sense for a narrative that explains things. And I'll use the example of the born-again Christians as the example here. When you fall into one of these churches, you get this book full of stories, and you get somebody that tells you the story of what the universe is like, and it's definite, it's certain, it's absolutely known that this is what the universe is like, and this is what your place in it is. It sets up a situation in which you're valued, you matter, like there is a plan for you in God's green earth, that sort of thing. And this comes along with a tight-knit community. The folks that are members of this church, they're all very friendly. They're very keen and chipper and willing to meet you and do absolutely everything they possibly can to help you. And so you're invited into this, and they're going to make your life right. They're going to solve the problems that you have. And sure, they might help you. They might do services for you. They might provide you with the counseling and the listening ear that you were never able to find in the outside world. This, of course, is very tempting, very alluring, because who wouldn't want that kind of thing? I would love something like that, and indeed, this is why I attend a Christian church, because it provides a lot of those same aspects. But where it differs, where my church differs from one of these born-again Christian churches, is this eschewing of responsibility. Because in the model of Christianity, the model of the universe that this thing ascribes to, there's a plan for you. There's a question of what's God's will. And so God is who is in charge. He, and it's usually a he, is deciding what it is the path of your life is like. And so this excuses you of responsibility. But it doesn't actually excuse you of responsibility. Because if anything good happens, well, it's God that did that. That's just God's plan for you. But if anything bad happens, like if you fall off the wagon, you start drinking again, you start doing the bad things, it's because you didn't have enough faith. It's because you weren't a good enough person. God's not showing favor to you because, well, you've done something wrong. You're a bad person. So there's this responsibility that's foisted on you only in the negative direction, never in the positive direction. Now, in the best case, this can work. Like, this certainly does do work for some people. And indeed, the non-toxic version of this results in basically the 12-step program. It's worked for a lot of people. I know some people who've done the AA model, and they've kicked their addictions, and they've continued to be off their addictions for years and decades. They're still struggling, of course, but they're not as enslaved to it as they once were. The healthy communities that come along with these things, they're absolutely great. And yes, my community at the church is absolutely spectacular. They make me feel happy, they welcome me, they love me as one of their own. But this isn't all these communities. These toxic forms of religious community, they basically do what Friedrich Nietzsche describes as sickness, as being priests of sickness. What the narrative of sickness does is provide you an anesthetic away from the pains of the world. You might have a problem in your world, in your family life, in your community life, in your own personal life that generates this form of pain. And that pain is real, like it's a distinct, real pain, even if it isn't physical. But rather than providing you with the tools, the agency necessary to solve that problem, oftentimes what these sorts of communities do is provide you with an excuse, provide you with a way out of that, and it might even like extract you physically from the source of your pain. And this is where the exclusionary principle starts to kick in. Folks that are recruited into this start to cut themselves off from the rest of their community, from their existing life. Even if some parts of that life are problematic, there are some parts that probably you shouldn't be cutting out. And this also sets up this hostile, this adversarial model within the person who's been recruited into this, in thinking that the people that don't believe this, that aren't part of this, cult, are the responsible parties for their pain. It gives them a target to project their aggression onto without actually changing anything about their actual situation. And this results in not always the most healthy communities. They seem to be very friendly and chipper and helpful, but on the other hand, they're subtly judgmental. They're trying to convince you of your responsibility for the bad things in your life, even if those things aren't really your problem. And just like any other drug, getting off of it is pretty difficult. Not only because you still want the anesthetizing quality of that religion, you still want to be able to believe in this thing that excuses you for responsibility, that provides you that reassurance, that provides you with that strong, tight-knit sense of community. But also the ideology itself is telling you that you can't get out, you shouldn't get out, because all those people out there are bad, they're evil, they're your problem. And the same can be said of basically any other cult-like community. You look at your flat earthers, you look at your QAnon folks, and they're not believing in the same thing, like they don't believe necessarily in the same thing that the born-again Christian communities might, but they still have an all-encompassing worldview that generates an explanation, an excuse from the individual for their problems, and then assigns blame to certain other aspects that are outside of this worldview that are the actual fault. And ultimately, this has a totalizing effect. This makes it so that everything in the universe can be explained by this one thing. Take someone in the case of Flat Earth. If you look at any social problem, look at any economic problem, look at any anxiety you might have in your life, it ends up being some weird explanation about a conspiracy theory. It's like Bill Gates and vaccines and blah, 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 the flat earth, which doesn't seem to make any sense to me, but in the internal worldview of somebody that believes this cluster of conspiracy theories, it makes perfect sense to them, but it divorces them from reality. And what's more, being divorced from reality, it prevents you from ever doing anything that might actually solve the problems you're having. The problem with Nietzschean sickness and the priests of sickness is that they anesthetize away any of the motivation that one might have to claim power, claim agency in your life. If the pain that you're experiencing is the result of not having agency, feeling a sense of directionlessness in your life, clinging to an ideology that prevents you from recognizing this will prevent you from ever claiming it, from ever being able to actually stand on your own 2 feet, or even find other people who can help you stand on your own 2 feet. It creates a dependency with that specific ideology, those specific people in that specific community, and none other. Now, I usually like to include a little, what can you learn component to these videos, but it's challenging to actually operationalize anything out of this one. Because folks that are in it, like somebody who's fallen down the rabbit hole into a cult like this, they're hard to reach, damn near impossible to reach. And there's a whole cluster of literature in terms of how do you deprogram somebody who's coming off of a cult? And if they're in the thick of it, if they're being fed by this, if they're in the middle of the addiction, there's nothing you can do. There's no way that you can access someone who's fallen down one of these worldview encompassing narratives. You can only really pick them up when they've fallen, much in the same way that it's easiest to deal with an addict when they've hit rock bottom, so to speak. So all I really can say is be compassionate, be understanding. Try and be supportive to folks that are in that place, and whatever you do, don't try and confront them, because basically what this does is attacks their worldview, which attacks their identity, their sense of self. And there's a very easy way to make them defensive if there were any. So I wish you all the best if you're struggling with someone like this. And, if you're in one of these things, you probably don't know you're in one of these things. So maybe give yourself a good hard look in case you are. Anyway, I make these videos daily, and I hope you enjoyed this content. If you liked it, algorithmic stuff, all that sort of stuff. And I'll have a long-form video essay about addiction coming probably tomorrow, I hope. So thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.